Dear colleagues, we are facing a very difficult crisis because of the coronavirus. This is no longer a regional issue, it is a global problem calling for a global response. We also know that it will eventually retreat, but we don't know when this will happen. We know this is a shock, which is somewhat unusual as it significantly is different to other previous crises. Why? Because it's affecting both the supply and the demand. On the supply side, it is affecting the supply because labor force won't be able to go to work because of health issues, but at the same time, because of the policies being implemented by countries, it will be impossible for them to do the current activities. This constraint will also create an effect over our economies. It will create a recession, and that will imply a significant demand shock. The global crisis of the coronavirus already has expanded to more than 308,000 people being infected globally. The number of people confirmed to have died is around 30,000 people, and we have 160 countries have confirmed active cases. The effect over the economic activity will be substantial. OECD already has calculated that the economic growth will decrease between 0.5 to 1.5%. We at FAO believe that this number could be even bigger. At the same time, other agencies have calculated how much people will move into poverty. And the number is around 30 million people, assuming only a 1% decrease in GDP growth. So imagine how this will affect food insecurity and undernourishment, and also overweight and obesity because of the change in diet patterns. We at FAO believe that it's time to respond with actions. We need to identify what are the actions that will help to minimize these potential risks. We fully agree with governments that first has to be health, and the measures that are taken in place have to be supported. But we also believe that second will come food. The food value chain needs to be kept alive to be able to have food available for consumers and to minimize the potential risk over undernourishment and, of course, poverty. To be able to do that, in this presentation, we are going to show some of the best practices that we have learned from the past, that we know they work, especially during the food crisis and in the recession of 2008. But we are also bringing the policies that countries are developing today, which we know have worked, like what happened in China, what is happening in South Korea, what is happening in Singapore, and what is happening in Denmark, for example. These best practices, we hope, will help government to promptly implement policies that will not only assure the health component, which is the core element, but also will help to keep the food value chain alive. Thank you very much. Coronavirus will put a strain over the food supply chain, and this is something that we need to look carefully, and this presentation is trying to bring indicators of what we can do. This food supply chain could be affected in several ways, and what we know up to now is that the supply chain is a very complex web of interactions. We have producers, processing, logistics, storage, and retail food. As the virus spreads and the cases mount and lockdowns increase, there is seemingly countless ways the food supply system will be tested and strained in the coming weeks and months. Today, no supply shock in sense of availability, but there is starting to be a supply shock in terms of logistics of movement of food. Upstream staple chain is less vulnerable because capital intensive than high-value commodities, which will be more vulnerable because they are labor-intensive, and labor is the factor that is going to be affected because of the health issues related to coronavirus. If we look carefully at the supply side, what we are expecting is less production, but this is not yet noticeable. We will expect lower freight rates and lower capacity use, and some indicators are already showing this. Food supply chain is to be disrupted mostly between April and May. And in developing countries, the reduction in labor force affecting labor-intensive forms of production will be important. As we mentioned before, in the cereals, we don't see an impact already, but the impact will be more important on the livestock sector, and this is induced because of the reports about the zoonotic origin of the problem, which not necessarily there is yet evidence about it, but also because of the diminished capacity of the slaughterhouses due to logistical constraints and labor shortages. This happened in China. Transport restrictions and quarantine measures likely to impede farmers' access to inputs and output markets, curbing productive capacity and denying a point of sale for produce, which could potentially raise also post-harvest losses. There will be shortages in labor, which could disrupt production and processing of food, especially in the labor-intensive crops, like high-value commodities. This is commodities that could perish very quickly. Also, the blockage in transportation routes could also affect fresh food supply distribution, and this could result in increased levels of food loss and waste. On the demand side, at the beginning of the diffusion of the disease, significant increase will happen in the demand, and we observed that in China. There was pressure on prices initially, and prices went up, but then they smoothly moved down because of the reduction of demand. Food demand in agriculture is generally inelastic, and the effect on overall consumption is very limited. Although, what we know from the previous food price crisis is that it could change the dietary pattern. For example, people could move to more calorie-intensive food because it's cheaper, and this, of course, could affect their diets and could end in overweight and obesity. There is a possible disproportionately larger decline in meat consumption. As I mentioned before, this could be because of the messages and information about zoonotic origins and other high-value products, which could create prices lapse. Specifically in the case of meat, FAO should play a role in bringing evidence and scientific information of the zoonotic origins to minimize this problem. Food demand in poorer countries is more income elastic, and loss of income earnings opportunities could cause consumption to contract. Aversion behavior, fear of contagion, could exacerbate the effect on food consumption through reduced visit to food markets. And we expect shifts in purchasing modalities, lower restaurant traffic, increased e-commerce, which was something central that we evidenced in China, and rising consumption at home. And again, this could create a big problem in import-dependent countries because there could be problems of access of food, and therefore import-dependent countries are very vulnerable to this situation. One of the bigger problems that are happening today is the devaluation of the exchange rate. As you can see in this table, in all countries, we are seeing a substantial devaluation of the exchange rate, all the red indicators shown in the tables. This means that the US dollar has become stronger and the local currencies are becoming weaker. This is something very problematic for import-dependent countries. For exporting countries, it's useful because they make them more competitive with respect to the US. But for import-dependent countries, this is very problematic, and even more for food import-dependent countries. So the devaluation is a key problem that we are observing of the exchange rate. Prices don't see yet any variation, especially in the staple commodities. Here we have the futures for wheat from 2018, January to March 2020. The prices are going down, futures. When we look at a shorter period from January to March 2020, still we don't see only a small spike at the end, but wheat doesn't show any effect because of the available supplies and available stocks. We have sufficient supply, a good bumper supply and stocks. If we look to maize futures, it's the same thing. We see a decline in prices, and we also see in the shorter period, still they are in decline. Something similar in soybeans. We don't see yet any reaction on the staple crop because, as we mentioned before, stocks are there, supplies are there. But when we look at rice, which is a thinner market, and as we see here, you have different types of rice, the Thailand rice, the India rice, the Vietnam rice, and the Pakistan rice. We are starting to see some changes in the level of prices and an increase in the last weeks. And that is reflected in the rice FAO price. So this is a commodity because the market is thinner that we need to look at more carefully. And this happened exactly the same in the case of the food price crisis in 2008, where we also observed rice was the commodity that started to increase its prices substantially and also increase volatility. Now, this is of course not the situation in high value commodities. Now, what to do? What are the actions? And the idea of this presentation is to bring actions of what we can do in the short term to be able to cope with this and to be able to keep the food supply value chain alive. First, we need to meet immediate needs of vulnerable populations. This means emergency food assistance, nutrition interventions, and safety nets to enhance and make more accessible food. This looks to promote school feeding, and this is a very important topic that we need to look carefully because the schools are closed in many countries. So how we can keep the program feeding kids, which before was in the schools, alive is very important because if not, we're going to affect a significant amount of vulnerable population in school age that we need to take care now. Second, we need to ensure that emergency food needs are fully met. Third, we need to protect basic consumption needs of vulnerable populations. Fourth, we need to scale up nutritional support. Fifth, we need to support management and prevention of undernutrition. 6, adjust social protection programs for food prices. 7, allow fit and predictable flow of food assistance. We also need to ensure that local purchases of food and food components for humanitarian purposes are exempt from any restriction. We need to explore the establishment of efficient and effective humanitarian food reserve. And be careful, we're mentioning here a strategic humanitarian food reserve. These are not the stocks for coping with prices. These are humanitarian stocks to be able to distribute the safety net programs, for example. And we need to reach all households with pertinent public information of food assistance, nutrition, and hardship alleviation programs. All these 10 elements are central in this emergency situation, and we need to keep and take care of all these 10 elements. For example, in the school feeding programs, the major concern we're observing today is that there is a closure of schools, which means millions of children no longer have access to food and nutrition, and they rely on schools to provide. In cases where they may still be open, there is no problem, but here we need to keep the services going. But the problem is in this case of the schools which are being closed. And here we have several options. We can work with the civil society to push to mobilize to provide food to children in need via food banks and local community groups. We also have in some high-income countries that the delivery is switched to food baskets and to go and grab meal mechanisms, like for example in the US. In some low-middle-income countries are maintaining canteens open or setting up for parents to collect food baskets. Some are depending on volunteer teachers to distribute, and private sector is also getting involved in delivery in few countries. And recent international recommendations so far point to the increase in cash transfers for families with children recipient of meals, redirection of food banks, involvement of NGOs, exoneration of taxes, among others. So one option is to convert that food that was going to school into cash transfers so that they can buy the food themselves and feed kids that before were being fed at the schools. On social protection programs, there will be potential disruptions because of the delivery of social safety net benefits and services due to the confinement measures, with the COVID-19 present new challenges and risks for the population. Social protection systems which are not risk-informed and do not have contingency operation procedures may face serious difficulties, including delays, coverage, operation, and financial capabilities. Here, cash and in-kind transfers are important. The actual delivery of cash and goods, when not done through electronic vouchers or cards, require gatherings and physical contracts, which are therefore not advisable during epidemic. One of the things that we observed in China was completely switched to mobile money, for example, which could be an option to do these cash transfers. The efficiency of cash transfers, e-vouchers, highly depends on the market characteristics, while COVID-19 may largely disrupt functioning of food systems. For cash transfers tied to conditionalities, the impossibility to access to health and education, for example, the major conditionality in conditional cash transfers, could trigger problems. So we need to leave those conditionalities. That's an important modification that we have to do to the conditional cash transfer programs. In the case of cash for work schemes, again, this could not work because the work components won't be able to implement given the quarantines being imposed on people. And therefore, we need to resolve this problem and keep transferring the cash to these workers to avoid them being affected substantially. There are two ways in which we can expand these programs. There is the vertical expansion of top-up, which means expand the transfer amount to existing social assistance participants through a one-off payment prior to a full-blown impact of the crisis. Peru, for example, has currently implemented this, and many other countries. Or there could be multiple payments over time to meet basic needs and avoid negative coping mechanisms after the crisis to support time for recovery. The SNAP in the US is one of these examples, one of 6E payment in Italy to households with children under 12, and also debt cancellations. The second way of expanding the safety nets is horizontal expansion of the social assistance programs, cash or in kind, to non-beneficiary participants of the existing program, but which are vulnerable to the crisis that we are facing today. And this, for example, could be the expansion of the amount of people being beneficiaries of this program. Also, we need to provide a complementary entitlement using contingency funding to offset loss of income. Focus on the small-scale producers, for example, in the case of Peru, a specific transfer for vulnerable families in addition to national cash transfer. If food insecurity becomes extremely severe due to the massive layoff, falls in remittance, we need to explore the use of food banks, which could be an option through not only direct provision of food by government, but also donations from individuals, solidarity networks, and non-governmental organizations. Here, we just list some recommendations based on the measures applied in different crises. For example, Ebola, the food crisis, and a specific natural disaster. All these recommendations, which we are providing the links, will help policymakers to understand what was done in those times and where we can learn and implement good policies that can be fast-tracked to minimize the problems we are facing and we will be facing in social protection programs. Some country examples. In the case of Peru, for example, the vulnerable population of 65s and older, which is clearly a vulnerable population of the COVID-19. There is a program, especially, which is called Pension 65, which target this population. So for this country, it will be easy to increase the benefits through to this population through increase of amount of payments of the safety nets. In the case of Italy, there are several measures that have been in place, from tax exemptions to independent workers and caregiver support transfers of a maximum of 1,600 euros. These are outlined in the recently released decree Cura Italia, which consists of 25 billion euros package. In New Zealand, in Portugal, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Many activities that are being implemented that we know they work, and from where we can learn, and for which we are providing the links to the detailed information in this presentation. Similar in Japan, in Australia, France, Thailand, the UK, and Northern Ireland. China has great valuable information on what just happened with the COVID-19 and how they try to resolve the problems and minimize the risks. The same in Taiwan. Singapore has also been very successful in their financial packages, and especially in establishing universal support schemes for citizens aged 21 and older, which receive a one-off cash payment of between $100 and $300 to help with their household expenses because of the economic slowdown. And in the case of the US, there also have been an implementation of a stimulus package to resolve the problems. What do we do in terms of the delivery? One of the major experiences is to work with mobile payment systems to prevent disruptions in delivery of cash entitlements due to restrictions on movement. This has been very successful in China. And I think we could take this opportunity to start moving this delivery to e-payments, so electronic payments, when possible, of course, because it will depend on the network and the availability of the networks in place. But that's a good mechanism to activate in many countries the mobile money mechanism, which could help to resolve the problem we are facing. We also encourage the delivery of secure and protected in-kind food assistance and protection kits when cash is not an option to the most vulnerable to COVID-19. This is the elderly persons or with chronic diseases, and this should be combined whenever feasible and safe. As we mentioned before, we need to remove conditionalities, and we need to target better so that we can use geographically targeting to access to food in the most vulnerable countries. Now, let me move to a second topic within the immediate needs of vulnerable populations. This is the urgent increase in food availability from a smallholder food production. There are four elements that we believe are critical in terms of smallholders. First, provide productivity-enhancing safety nets. Second, reduce post-harvest crop losses and improve food stocks along the value chain. So improve the storage capacity across the value chain. Third, remove artificial constraints to domestic trade throughout the food chain in order to link smallholder farmers to markets. And this is very important because with the lockdowns, the possibility that there will be constraints of mobility of the food will be very important. And this could avoid farmers to access to markets, especially smallholders. And we need to resolve those. And finally, address basic energy needs of smallholders and rural households. What we know that road closures and blockage and checks could prevent farmers to get to markets. And we need to find a way to resolve this, especially in the case of high-value perishable commodities. We observed that in China, there was significant losses on vegetables, on livestock, and poultry because of these closures. And that's something we need to learn from, how to avoid that to happen. Change on consumption patterns and consumer behavior. Markets witness an increase in both staple food and ready-to-eat food that can be stored, and also a strong increase on e-commerce. In Italy, demand for flour increased by 80%, canned meat by 60%, canned beans by 55%, tomato sauce by 22%. This trend led to difficulty to sell this product, so we need to be ready now. We know what happened in other countries. Closure of farmer markets will prevent farmers to direct sell to consumers, leading to loss of income and loss in perishable food. So we need also to learn from this. Small farmers that supply school meal schemes will be substantially affected because of the school closure. And as we mentioned before, in the case of the school feeding programs, there have to be alternatives. And we need to keep this value chain from smallholders active to supply in these alternative ways. If not, they will be substantially affected. Restrictions on the movement of people may disrupt production. This especially will affect migrant seasonal workers, and this constitutes 27% of the rural agriculture working hours. So again, we need to find solutions. This will be a type of labor force that will be severely impacted by this crisis. What we learned from China, for example, we learned an introduction of a series of vegetable basket policies to stabilize production and supply, combining conventional channels and emergency channels, combining traditional circulation and new business formats, and working to reduce the impact of the epidemic on the purchase and sale of agricultural products to the small farmers. So this idea of vegetable baskets is very important. They also coordinate 9 provinces, autonomous regions, and municipalities to establish collaborative mechanism platforms for joint guarantee of the supply in Hubei province. They implement measures to improve the interconnection of farmers and merchants and improving the agricultural supply chain system. These include grains, oil, vegetables, meat, eggs, milk, aquatic products in the scope of daily necessities during the epidemic prevention and control period. And they also find ways to improve transportation. So when we refer to keep transportation going and when we refer to keep the food value chain going, this means within the context of healthiness. We need to have the mechanism in place of rapid temperature checks and all the tests we need to do to assure that the labor force that is working in these value chains is active, but is also operating under proper health measures. Other policies in China were funding for agricultural distribution companies, implementation of measures to expand rural employment and rural income by promoting rural employment promotion, of the resumption of production in rural small, medium, and micro enterprise rural innovations. In some places, the local governments has unified purchases, centralized slaughtering houses, and cold chain storage of the country cooperative and enterprise raising markers that are over 100 days old and running out of stock. So we need to find the way to combine and to use properly the value chain. E-commerce is central, and in countries and locations where we can empower e-commerce, this is the way to go, because this will facilitate trade, it will reduce the health risks, and will allow access to food markets. So for example, special subsidies for smallholders, increasing the centralized procurement of agricultural products from core producing areas, investment in green logistics, and dedicated line to agricultural production through e-commerce mechanism could be an option, which is very important. Big data platform to obtain and monitor the detailed information is central. Countries need to inform about where food is available and how they can be procured. And if we combine this with e-commerce, I think it will be an additional benefit to what we produce. Italy has also implemented other policies that have allowed to improve the flow of food. For example, farmers will be able to request advance payments of 70% of the annual non-repayable contributions, so they will facilitate income to farmers which could be affected under the Common Agricultural Policy. They also have given transfers, and also they have given a compensation of 600 euros to agricultural workers with short-term contracts for the month of March. So they're trying to target the major populations that will be vulnerable because of this crisis. And there are many other policies implemented that we need to learn from. One other topic which is important is rural finance in the world of smallholders. And a number of countries are implementing stimulus packages, but without clear incentives to smallholder farmers. So we need to find ways in which we can make this also beneficial for smallholder farmers so that they can keep producing and have access to liquidity to keep their value chains active. Procurement is really important, grants to the most vulnerable, and global funding facilities for the most vulnerable countries also is really important. Considering the impact on the small farmers, on countries with very limited fiscal capacity, this could be devastating for them. And here is where international funding should be raised. The World Bank has developed a facility, the IMF has developed a facility, but this needs to be targeted to smallholder farmers, like what AGAF FSP did in 2007 and 2008 during the food price crisis. Let me move to a third element, which is extremely important for the immediate needs of vulnerable populations, and these are issues related to trade and tax policies. First, we need to encourage better functioning of food markets through improved regional political and economic integration and better function for trade in food. We need to avoid what we observed in 2007 and 8 food price crisis. We need to avoid countries that to compete between them and blocking their markets to don't allow flow of food from one location to the other. The only thing that generate is losses, social losses and inefficiencies. There is significant evidence from the food price crisis that we need to learn from to avoid these problems. We need to immediately review trade and taxation policy options and their likely impacts. Avoid generalized subsidies for food consumers. Reduce restrictions on use of stocks, especially in emergency stocks, which needs to be distributed for the safety net mechanism. Improve efficiency of trade facilitation. Use limited strategic grain reserves. Minimize use of export restrictions. Reduce import tariffs and other restrictions to cope with increases of the cost because of the exchange rate and also because of potential price increases. And temporarily reduce VAT and other taxes, value-added taxes and other taxes, so that consumers could absorb the changes in the cost as a result of the devaluation, for example. We know that because of the coronavirus outbreak, countries around the world will start to implement a number of policy measures aimed to avoiding the further spread of the disease. However, such measures might affect agricultural production and trade, especially trade. For instance, many countries are implementing higher controls on cargo vessels with the risk of jeopardizing shipping activities. Similarly, measures of affecting the free movement of people, such as seasonal workers, might have an impact on agricultural production, thus affecting market prices globally. Likewise, measures to guarantee acceptable health standards in food factories may also down production. So we need to be careful with this. And in a number of countries, including China and the US and the European Union, have implemented and announced a set of policy measures aimed at addressing this type of problem. But the major problem here is to avoid any restriction to trade. This is not the time to do this. This is the time to cooperate between countries to be able to assure that the food value chain at the global level and the global value chains operate properly and efficiently. Here, we are showing some of the evidence that we have. For example, disruption of production during previous disease outbreaks, supply disruptions because of shortage of labor, and support to agriculture. We're just providing links of practices that we observed before that can be useful. The same with tariff cuts to ensure supply of food, and also problems related to shipments. So all these elements are elements that we need to take into account. But again, let me repeat, it's a time for cooperation between countries, and it's not the time to impose any trade barrier or any constraint that will restrict mobility of goods across the world, and especially to most vulnerable populations. Finally, we need to manage macroeconomic implications. Hold down core inflation and inflation expectations. Many countries are doing packages of support, financial packages of support to reduce the shock to the demand. And this could end in inflation. So we need to be very careful, especially with food inflation. Just for example, the devaluation of exchange rate for net food importing countries could create food price inflation. And that's something that we need to cope with. We need to assess the impact on the balance of payments and the feasibility and sustainability of reserve drawback. Many countries are moving. This is more institutionalized in developed countries, but in developing countries, especially today, in the most vulnerable countries in Africa, for example, which all of them have debt ratios, which are far over their limits, any of these activities will create a burden. So here is where international support should come and play a role. We need to mobilize external support to finance additional food imports, and that is the most importantly in the food crisis countries, which a big amount of them are in Africa, in the Africa region. So that's where we need to basically put a solution to that. We need to ensure adequate levels of foreign exchange reserves so that this can happen and they can be supported, and assess and comprehensively cost all fiscal measures taken in response to the rise of food prices. We need to be very careful. Ministries of Finance and Treasuries need to be very careful to value what they are doing so that it can be manageable and sustainable. And also it needs to be 100% clear that these are temporary measures during the period of the crisis. Thank you very much for hearing this presentation, and we will keep updating the policies that we learned that are working in many other countries through a platform that we will set up at the FAO website for the coronavirus, the COVID-19. Thank you very much.